Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us at the Sherlock Conversations. I am here with probably Mr. Sherlock himself. We are chatting with the great Leslie Klinger, who has, oh my goodness, he has probably contributed to the Sherlock mythos about as much as, well, anybody can in this day and age, right up there next to Arthur Conan himself, maybe a few other guys out there, but Leslie, we're here to talk about your brand new book. It's called In the Shadow of Agatha Christie, Forgotten Female Crime Writers from 1850 to 1916, and it is from Pegasus Books. I got to ask, how proud are you to have another book under your belt like this?
Well, it's great. This one seems to be getting a lot of nice attention. It's the fourth in my series of what I've been calling the In the Shadow books, and it was a lot of fun to do. There are two Sherlockian connections to the book. One, it was inspired by the lecture given by Sarah Koretsky to the Baker Street Irregulars audience in 2017. She was the distinguished speaker for the BFI, and her talk was about Victorian women crime writers who had gotten forgotten. She spoke primarily about Anna Catherine Green and Meta Fuller, but as I sat there in the audience, actually I'm the host of the series, so I knew she was going to talk about it. As I sat there, having introduced her, I said to myself, gee, somebody should do an anthology of their stories. And so I did it myself. The other Sherlockian connection is that I was delighted to include as one of the stories, a story by Carolyn Wells. Carolyn Wells was not only a prolific writer of mysteries, she was probably the world's first female Sherlockian. She and Arthur Bartlett Maurice and Harry David Thurston, who Maurice and Thurston were respectively the junior and senior editors of the Bookman magazine. The three of them had a little cabal. They loved Sherlock Holmes. They had a very active conversation about Sherlock as the Hound of the Baskervilles was appearing in 1901, and the word Sherlockian first appeared in the Bookman magazine of that era. Wells was a devoted fan, and this is a little story she wrote that's a pastiche called The Adventure of the Remarkable Clothesline. It's actually a pastiche of many other detective figures as well, and it has Frederick Dorsteel illustrations, so how could I resist?
Of course. Oh, that's amazing. When it comes to pastiches, now I understand that, I forget who it was that I was speaking to, but no, it was somebody that I was listening to, that Sherlock pastiches were popping up in World War I, from what I understand.
Yeah, absolutely. And long before that. The first pastiches and parodies appeared almost immediately after the adventures. I haven't found anything prior to 1891, but the adventures were so popular that there were immediately parody versions of some of them. Nobody was writing, quote, Sherlock Holmes tales because Conan Doyle was alive and well, and there were certain copyright issues. But no, what you're talking about are the wonderful trench magazines that were published during World War I by soldiers for soldiers, and they included a series of Sherlock Holmes stories.
That's what it was.
And they're wonderful. I have some of them. It's almost impossible to find the original magazines, but there is a collection of the Wipers Times, which was one of the newspapers that was published. So that's a good way to get your hands on those stories.
Right. Well, what did Doyle think of those? Did he not care? Because it's kind of like it's sort of like a sort of known secret that Doyle had a love-hate relationship with the character. Was he
Sure.
touched by that, or did he kind of like not?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, he was amused by it, and as long as they weren't invading his copyrights, he was just fine with it. I mean, how could he not be honored and amused at the wealth of parodies that appeared, um, including such notables as Mark Twain and Bret Hart, who wrote parodies of Holmes, and so. I mean, I can't. I've never seen any
Right.
direct commentary by him on it, but I think he said imitation was the sincerest form. Someone said imitation was the sincerest form of flattery. He must have been flattered.
Right, right, of course. And speaking of like the, I guess you call them like the flattered. Now, obviously, the like reading Sherlock, it inspires other people into different imaginations and going in different directions. And how much of an influence do you think Doyle had on Agatha Christie herself?
Oh, well, she was clearly a fan. She herself wrote a pastiche. It's in the book called Partners in Crime, involving her detective pair, Tommy and Tuppence, a young sort of gadabout couple. And there's a story in that, I've forgotten the name of it, The Adventure of the Something or Other, and it clearly was an homage to Holmes. That entire generation was certainly influenced. I mean, Dorothy Sayers, of course,
Right.
was a great Sherlock Holmes scholar and fan.
Right.
But that's really, Christie's first book is 1922. So that's really late in the scheme of things.
Right, right. But the two of them, I don't want to say like they probably knew the same people who knew the same people type of thing.
Of course, of course. They were both involved in the detection club, and they certainly knew the circles of people. There's a charming pastiche, just which was read by Martin Edwards as his talk this year at the Distinguished Speakers Lecture, about a meeting of the Detection Club in which they attempted to get Holmes and Watson themselves to attend, but they were unable to convince Holmes that he should attend the meeting of the club. So back to In the Shadow of Agatha Christie. The first book in that, quote, series is called In the Shadow of Sherlock Holmes. And I conceived it as, I guess, a tribute to some wonderful mystery writers whose brilliant detectives had gotten lost in the shadow of Sherlock Holmes.
Right.
Holmes sort of sucked all the air out of the room, and nobody remembers that there were other great detectives that were being penned during that time period. Subsequently, I did In the Shadow of Dracula and In the Shadow of Edgar Allan Poe. Those were respectively vampire and horror stories. But this one, I wanted to look at the writers on whose shoulders Agatha Christie stood. And there were many of them. The collection includes English, American, and Austrian and Australian writers. And the Australians are especially remarkable. There's
Right.
a woman, Mary Fortune. I included a story by her in the book. Mary Fortune wrote over 500 mystery stories. They are essentially police procedurals, and they appeared primarily in magazines in Australia, all of them anonymously.
Right.
And she was discovered really by an early mystery scholar.
Right. Let me ask this: when it says anonymously, in fact, kind of, I find it fascinating. The topic even of the book of the forgotten female crime writers. Was the reason why she was anonymous because she was female? I mean, there's a
Probably.
big. It's all known that that the author of the Harry Potter books, J.K. Rowling, they used her initials J.K.
Sure.
So that they, for whatever reason, they didn't think a female writer would be as popular as she was.
I
Uh,
think that I
and
think that's absolutely right. You look at some of the other writers in the book. You have M.E. Braddon. You have C.L. Purkis, for example, writing with initials because that way their gender was ambiguous. And when women did write, they usually wrote under Mrs. So and so, so and so. So you have Mrs. Harriet Spofford. No, it was. There were plenty of women writers, but I think in the mystery field especially, there was a sense that even that early, that they weren't going to be intelligent, smart, tough kind of stories unless they were written by men, which is of course nonsense.
right,
But at the same time, there were men writing about women detectives. So you have, for example, the experiences of Dorcas Dean by George Sims, and the very first book called Experiences of a Lady Detective, the very first female detective that we know of, was probably written by a man.
right, right. Now, when you were putting this book together, okay, you've got the idea for this. You're like, you know what? Let's do something with forgotten female writers and everything. How did you start picking? Did you have a group of friends you called up and said, "Hey, I want to do something about forgotten female mystery writers"? Do you guys know anybody off the top of your head, or did you have a list of them already, or how did you go about picking them? And then when you did pick them, how did you know which of their mystery stories to pick?
Well, so somebody asked me the other day if I had my staff do the research. But wow, what a great idea to have a staff.
Yeah.
No, typical of almost any book that I do, I ran out and bought a bunch of books, and I already had some of them. There are some other anthologies of female detectives, not necessarily female writers.
Right.
There are a couple of fine ones, including one by my friend Michelle Slung. There are probably 3 or 4 scholarly books about women in the mystery world. And so I Googled around, searched on bookstore lists, and found appropriate books and started reading and looking. And I am a great fan of Victorian mystery generally. So I have a lot of source materials. I have a lot of collections. And I went through them and picked out the ones that, after I identified, first of all, sort of who were the pioneers, who were the women that needed to be included. Then I read critical material about them and followed the guide of those stories that seemed worthy. I tried in general to go with stories that weren't heavily anthologized already, although I did include one. I included Susan Glaspell's Jury of Her Peers, which is a very popular story, but it's such a powerful story that I wanted to include it.
Right. Now, when you were reading the novels, like, I want to see if you agree with me on this, and feel free to point out where I may not be correct. But I usually find that in detective fiction, in the larger sense of the words, you've got the 2 types. You've got the Sherlockian type, and then you have the Sam Spade, Philip Marlowe type, which is basically, Sherlock is basically, he'll sit there, think about the problem, study it. He has a vast knowledge of things, and he'll say, oh, that's not true because of X, Y, and Z. Let's go investigate. Oh, X, Y, and Z. Whereas the Philip Marlowe, Sam Spade style, you have a list of them. Keep turning over as many rocks as we possibly can until we get the guy. Like, we kind of have an idea of who the villain is, so we'll just kind of keep questioning and turning things over and over and over again until, like, there's almost a level of perseverance to it. And that's usually kind of where the two character, like the 2 archetypes, I guess you could say, kind of fall into place. Did you find that with mysteries in general?
Well, I mean, if you're making a distinction between amateurs and professionals, that's a little different. I mean, that's not quite what you were saying. You were saying, what should we call them? Plotters versus rationalists, who sort of take in the gestalt of the problem and come up with a solution.
Right. If I may say it this way, you have your chess players versus your football players, if that makes sense. Yeah, we could get in there and just basically, I just have to be bigger and faster than that guy to take him on. Whereas with chess, there's a level of, it's a lot more cerebral, is basically how I'm asking it.
Right. I'm not sure that that's a fair distinction. I mean, first of all, certainly the earliest mystery stories were largely what we would now call police procedurals. We have to remember that the detective, the police detective, is a modern invention, modern meaning a 19th century invention. And the public was fascinated by that. And of course, in the real world, there weren't brilliant detectives who took in the scene and said, aha, it must be so-and-so who does it, and then go out to prove it. They're all basically the same style, gathering the evidence, interviewing the witnesses, and trying to look for the threads. And that is the style that pervaded for a long time, so that we have Inspector Bucket, we have Sergeant Cuff, created by Inspector Bucket, Charles Dickens, Sergeant Cuff, a creature of Wilkie Collins, and so on. And they're smart, they're astute about human nature, but they basically go one step at a time, and they keep interviewing witnesses and all that. It really isn't until we get to Holmes that we get this sort of new idea, although it's not limited to the Holmeses of the world. Certainly Philo Vance, for example, a very popular detective in the late 20s and 1930s, claims to have, in the first case, for example, the Benson murder case, he solved the mystery, as soon as he met the murderer, and basically saw that his psychological profile fit what he thought the crime itself told him about the kind of person that would have committed it. And that's clearly the kind of ratiocination that you're talking about, I think. Now, he doesn't make deductions, he basically says psychology is his tool.
Right.
Those tangible clues. But the distinction between the professional and the amateur, that's a different schism, and that started really, I mean, if you look at, take for example Wilkie Collins in The Moonstone or The Woman in White, you've got professional detectives, but the solution is arrived at by the amateurs. Are deeply involved and meet lots of people. So the amateur detective really began back in the middle of the 19th century as well. And then again, we have, I mean, Holmes is kind of in the middle. Official. So that's a little different than compared to, for example, the detective in The Moonstone.
Right.
Who is just one of the characters, and he decides it's his family and friends he's going to solve the crime. He's not a professional detective.
Right. Now, did you, because you were doing this by regions and everything, did you notice that there was a different flair for different things, depending on where they were located? Like if they were stories that came from the United States, there was a common theme that you would see there, or even just something silly, like everybody had a red chair they sat in or something like that, or like versus Australia versus England. Did you see anything like that?
Well, what we see is that the countries that have well-developed police forces have stories about police forces. So Mrs. Groner, who wrote about an Austrian police officer, she's really the first great Austrian mystery writer. she wrote about police because Austria had a police force, and she knew what they did, and she was familiar with it and all that. The same in Australia. Mary Fortune, for example, writes about a bushranger, a cop whose job it is basically to wander the country and take care of crimes everywhere. So that's what is here. I mean, yeah, sure, the stories reflect the culture of the nation. Susan Glassbill's Jury of Her Peers, for example, is very much a rural tale.
Right.
And some of the others by the American writers were also rural in that respect. But I don't think, I think you'd have a hard time telling the nationality of the writers from their stories.
Right.
With the exception of, specific geographic references.
Right, right. Well, because I just wondered if it was sort of like along the lines of like the American theme of, like if you were to watch action movies of the 1980s with Americans, they kind of almost a good chunk of them fell into some same plot where you would have the hero, he does something awesome, but then he endures some sort of fall, and then he goes away, and then he goes away and he gets some sort of training or additional things, and then he comes back kind of like stronger than ever or something like that. And it was pointed out that it was sort of like in American themes there's a level of we're going to pick ourselves up by our bootstraps type of thing. And as opposed to, like, say, England is more or less, there's a politeness that they have. I mean, like, even when you read the Holmes stories, you see that sort of Victorian politeness that works its way through each of the stories in certain terms. I mean, yes, there's murder and crime, of course, but there's a level of politeness between them. Like, you don't see, like, Holmes going, boy, I'm gonna like rip your head off and spit down the whole blah 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 type of thing. Like Holmes will say something like, "You will answer for your crimes." You know what I mean? Like you don't see him going all growly and everything.
Of course, but I don't think you see that in the American stories either.
Okay.
I mean, if you read a book, it depends on the time period. It's more a matter of the time than the country. If you look at, for example, pick out the Leavenworth Case by Anna Catherine Green, one of the great mystery novels of all time. It's all set in America. It has a sort of Victorian flavor because America also was influenced by the Victorian age. Had those same kinds of mores and the same kinds of social classes and all that. So you see a lot of the same things in the American stories. Unless they're set in the West,
right?
They're going to or a French story where the classes, same class consciousness exists,
right?
So no, I don't think there is a distinctive American voice in that I could find, at least not in the 19th century. With even, for example, in the dime novels, where we have a lot of sort of Horatio Alger kind of, young boys rising to success, they emulate a detective, they want to be a detective, etc. That's a very American kind of thing, you think. But there are English ones too. There are also similar stories in England that were aimed at the same market of what we now call the Horatio Alger story.
Right. When you were putting these stories together, did you have to basically, did you kind of like sort them by crimes as well? Like, did you go, hey, you know what? I think we've gotten too many angry spouse shooting the husband stories, or we've gotten too many murder stories, or we've gotten too many somebody stole my wallet story, or like somebody stole the money in the safe. Like, did you kind of have to like at all sort them by that type of theme?
That would have been a good idea, but I didn't. Basically, what I did was I picked the writers that I wanted to include, and then found a sort of an appropriate story by that writer, appropriate with regard to length, appropriate with regard to theme. Some of the genre is not really thought of as a genre in the 19th century. So these people wouldn't have said they were writing mystery stories.
Right.
They were writing stories, and many of them are mystery themed. But so it was really sort of a matter of sorting through some of the writer's stories and picking up the ones that I thought would appeal to modern sensibilities. They're not all detective stories, and you know, they didn't. Not all these writers involve detectives. Some of them are crimes. Some of them, they're all crime stories, but that's why we use the word crime fiction and not mysteries or detectives. So.
Right, exactly. The other thing I was going to ask is that as you're working, as you were working through this, were there any stories that stood out? Yeah, that was my wife checking on her turtle right there. Yeah, so sweetest woman on the planet is like, she got me t-shirts for Christmas that say 221B and other things like that. I don't think I could have a bigger person supporting me, and as our thank you, we got her the turtle. So that's what that was about. Why she was.
Okay. We all need a supportive family. For years, I've had children who have been scouts for me, and my daughter, for example, is a school teacher, and she gets the Scholastic, you know, My Weekly Reader Scholastic publications. There's always some little cartoon or icon of Sherlock Holmes or whatever, and she'll clip it out and send it to me. So.
Oh, and if I may show you this real quick, I went and saw, speaking of Sherlock, just kind of go off on this just for a little bit. I went to the movies today and I saw Black Panther. Totally worth your time. It's got the fact that it had Martin Freeman in it. And look what I took a picture of. I don't know if you can see this.
Sherlock Gnomes. Well, I'm excited about it. I'm disappointed that I didn't get to be more involved. I actually had some early contact with the screenwriters. They said they were going to send me the script to read, and they just never got around to it. So.
No kidding. Wow. Well.
And, oh well.
Yeah, I got to say that the one thing that makes me sad is they're not using a British guy. And this is, I don't mean to be silly about this, but a lot of if they had actually gotten, I don't know, if they'd gotten a little stunt casting with it, you know, like an Ian McKellen or Robert Downey Jr. or something.
Wait till you see Holmes and Watson with Will Ferrell. If you're
well, somebody. When it comes to Sherlockians, there's sort of a cycle that they all go through where you've got some seriousness for a number of years, and then a couple of TV shows that pop up, and then they start doing self-parody at that point, and that's
There's a saying in Los Angeles, famous Hollywood saying, everybody wants to be the first to be second.
Weird. That's awesome. So, but I didn't know how serious they were with it, because I hadn't heard anything more, because I had been keeping an eye out for it, but I hadn't heard anything more about the Will Ferrell project. So
not serious enough to ask me to read the script is the answer. So, you know, we'll see.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm sorry, let's jump back to In the Shadows. I'm going to keep this in because I love this exchange that we had. And it also, it was really nice just to kind of show families, how families is, and I support my spouse type of thing. So I think I like that little thing.
So one of the things that I am happiest about, I mean, my reading career goes like this. When I was a kid, I started reading science fiction. I read science fiction heavily, maybe even exclusively, until really I was in college, when of course I was reading lots of other things as well as science fiction. And then in law school, I discovered Sherlock Holmes. I really must say, and I've said this many times publicly, that while I probably read one or two stories as a kid, they made no impression on me. I was hooked by the Baring Gould annotated Sherlock Holmes, which I received as a gift in 1968. And once I discovered Holmes, I said, aha, mysteries. And at that point, I started to read other things as well. And I reached out and read Chandler and Hammett and Dorothy Sayers and Agatha Christie and the like, because I discovered this whole other genre that I had missed. And one of the great joys has been to dig deeper and deeper into the history of the genre. So, as I said, the In the Shadow of Sherlock Holmes book was a great deal of fun. This was fun. My next big book that comes out in the fall is called Classic American Mysteries of the 1920s. It's a heavily annotated volume. I describe this book as lightly annotated. You know, there's maybe one or two footnotes for each story, mainly vocabulary.
Right.
But Classic American Mysteries is a full, massive, hundreds and hundreds of notes annotated volume. It's got the first Charlie Chan mystery, the first Philo Vance, the first Queen. We'll see. Comes out also from Pegasus. And so once again, I dove into the history of the mystery. I wrote a long introduction, sort of spanning 2,000 years of mystery writing, to try and bring it up to how did we get there? What was the state of American mystery writing in the 1920s?
Right. Well, I was going to ask that. Why is it that mysteries are still so popular, that there's always like at least 2 or 3 mystery shows on TV at a time? I mean, you go into any section of your library, or if they still had video stores, there's always, like, you look in the British section, even on Hulu or something, and there's always at least several different mysteries or something like that. What is it about the mystery that, like, let me put it this way. Last time you and I had a conversation, I asked you, what does it say about humanity that we keep going back to Sherlock Holmes? Let me kind of sequel to that and ask, what does it say about people that we keep going back to the mystery, that there's always going to be a
extension of what we talked about with Holmes, which is the desire to rationalize the world, the desire to master the world, happen to us, to make sense of them. And mysteries are a great little cosmos in which reason is imposed on disorder, on chaos. There's been a terrible crime. Somebody has broken the rules. Rules are upheld and everything is reasonable and orderly. And that's the mystery. That's the mystery story, the mystery novel is that. Now, crime fiction is a little more complicated than that. My theory, and I'm not sure, I'm not sure there are other scholars, or there are any real scholars out there who support my thesis. The American crime writing started in the pulpits of churches in the 1600s, when ministers would preach about true crime. So they would give a sermon about Don Smith, the nasty criminal, who was now going to be hanged, and he's going to repent. He's repenting of his crimes now. Here's where he went off. This is a moral lesson. And so they gave these sermons. The sermons were wildly popular. People loved hearing the stories of criminals. I believe some of the ministers ran out of materials, so they made up stories. And these were published, by the way.
Right.
They were very popular. That is echoed in England with the the calendar with the Newgate calendar, which was a publication that essentially recounted the stories of criminals who were going to be hanged at Newgate Prison. And in America, we had a phenomenon called the broadsides. The broadsides were penny newspapers that did the same thing. They told, and early books in the mystery field, in the crime writing field, are collections of those stories, except that the authors probably invented some of them, maybe all of them in a particular. You have Chronicles of the Boston and so on, and it's perfectly clear that not all those chronicles and experiences really happened.
Right.
The author supplemented them with made-up stories, and of course, as the genre developed, the stories finally admitted that they were made up and became more and more popular. But I think that the mystery, that crime writing in America began with those true. History of the same in England, by the way.
So your belief is that a lot of the morality tales that pastors would use, like, therefore you shouldn't steal. Let me tell you about someone who did steal. It was
right.
Mr. So-and-so who stole money, and now he is being led up to this. Now he's in the process, like something bad's going to happen to him because he's like now in jail for the next 25 years because he stole money from this person, and he shouldn't be stealing, right, and you shouldn't be stealing, type of thing.
Right.
So, and then they became popular. Let me ask this, from start to finish, when you came up with the idea, what was the process of it? Did you submit the idea to Pegasus, or?
Yes. So what happened was, it was really very quick. I mean, it was an incredibly quick timeline. The distinguished speaker lecture was Thursday night. The following evening, I was having drinks with Claiborne Hancock, the publisher of Pegasus, and I said to him, "Let me tell you this idea I have for an anthology." And he said, "It sounds great." We shook hands, and we had a deal. And as soon as, and before I even left New York after the birthday weekend, I was starting to poke around for books on the subject, starting to poke around. I think I turned in the book probably 3 months later. It was very fast.
Wow.
I mean, I had the bit in my teeth. It was good timing. I wasn't working on anything else at the moment. And I mean, you know, I'll tell you, Don, that's the way that I write in general. I'm not a guy who gives a lot of there's not a lot of thinking time about projects that isn't doing time.
Right,
and
right.
When I say thinking time, I mean, I don't sit around contemplating the idea for a long time. I tend to plunge into the research. I may abandon the project after I've done some research, but this is my lawyer background. I mean, this is, you know, it's writers who are journalists or lawyers. You'll never hear us talk about writer's block.
Right.
It's I've often said, I can't tell my clients, I'm sorry, I can't get that project done because I have writer's block.
Right.
The clients want the project done, so you just kind of get to it. And that's the way I approach all my books, is just sort of get to it. So.
Right. Finish that up. Now, and you say the current mystery one that you're working on right now. Let's see, I want to look back through my notes and see what I had. The one about American, it was called American Mystery.
Classic American,
yes.
Classic American crime fiction in the 1920s.
Okay. And are you, is it the same thing with that? Like, it takes you about 3 months to finish that, work on that?
No. It's a much bigger project. Because it's just a lot longer. I mean, that one I did heavy annotation. So that one was basically about a year and a half in the making.
Gotcha.
And so, and my hope is that that will turn into a series. I've started to give some thought to what would be the contents of the 1930s volume, but I certainly haven't started working on it yet. We'll wait to see how the book does.
Right, right. That makes sense. Gotcha. So, I mean, have you also, because you mentioned you had a love of science fiction, would you ever be interested in going back and working your way through the old pulp stories? Because I'll tell you this, one of the things that I think is so much fun to do, if you go to LibriVox and go to the science fiction section, they have like at least 45 to 50 short story collections that somebody does. That what they did was they've gone through Project Gutenberg, found a whole bunch of short stories that were in pulp magazines that for whatever reason lapsed in their copyright, and these guys record it, and it is genuinely so much fun because you can kind of hear future history from what people thought it was going to be like back in the 30s and 40s. Have you ever thought about doing something along those lines?
I have. Of course, I've done Lovecraft, and Lovecraft was heavily published in the pulps, almost exclusively published in the pulps. But his last material is in the 1930s. You know, I've thought about doing some later things. My favorite science fiction novel of all time, The Star Is My Destination by Alfred Bester, would be brilliant to annotate. The problem is trying to find the market. One of the things that the publishers have insisted on is they'd like at least the prospect of making money. Not a surety, but a prospect.
Right.
So they want books that have built-in audiences, that have a strong readership. And so on the one hand, might I do an anthology? Sure, that would be fun. But to do a heavily annotated set would probably be impractical because the books just don't sell well enough to merit that kind of treatment. I'd love to do H.G. Wells. I have long wanted to do War of the Worlds and The Time Machine and The Invisible Man in an annotated format. And who knows? That might happen in the next 5 years. We'll see. So I have a lot of things on my plate about things that I'd like to do. I will tell you, although we haven't given any publicity to it yet, but we've shaken hands on doing an annotated edition of Neil Gaiman's American Gods.
Oh, very nice.
That will come out, I'm not sure when, 2019, I guess. So we haven't, of course, I haven't even started it yet, but I'm very excited about that.
Right.
See what else. And as I said, I hope the 20s volume does well, and I'll then turn to the 1930s. And I have a second volume of Lovecraft stories coming out in 2019.
So it's keeping you busy, if anything.
Absolutely.
Gotcha.
Absolutely.
I don't
and of
know.
Course, Laurie King, I should plug one more Sherlockian thing.
Sure.
You know about the series of anthologies that Laurie King and I have co-edited.
Yes.
And we have a fourth volume called For the Sake of the Game that comes out in December.
Very nice. Can I hold you to this? Can I have both you and Miss King on to promote that when it comes out?
I will, subject to her schedule. She's busier than I am, but I think we'd enjoy doing that probably early next year. So
that would be fantastic. Forgive me, I'm going to pin you on this one. I don't know what you can and can't say. What are the rumors of a third Robert Downey Sherlock movie?
Everybody wants to do it. As far as I know, there is no script yet, and you know, so fingers crossed.
Gotcha. A lot of people are hoping for that. So.
That's right. So.
Gotcha.
Great. Well, great,
Leslie,
Don. It's been great to talk.
Leslie, it's been fantastic.